So the first order of business, I just want to make sure everybody, can you see the PowerPoint on the screen now? I
Yeah.
see an, okay. That's always good. The thing that I worry about with doing these is the technological part of it. Right, it is 10 o'clock now, according to to my watch or my cell phone. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. You may see where I pause a couple times just to check on people as they come into the waiting room, that we might have a couple people come in later. So just to let you know, that's what's going on during that time. So if you're here for, I hope that you're here because you wanted to attend the Applying for Grants of Funders Perspective training this morning. Before we get started, I just want to do a little housekeeping. I'll ask everybody that they please make sure that they mute themselves unless they're asking a question. And that way we don't hear dogs barking and sirens going in the background. And I will be taking questions. I'm going to try to pause a couple times during the presentation to take questions, and then definitely at the end there will be ample opportunity to ask any questions. And if you feel more comfortable just putting those questions into the chat, you can do that at any time. And then I'll when I check for pause for questions, I'll look up at those questions and answer those questions as well. But I'm going to pause here just a second. I see we have a couple people to admit into the meeting, so I'll do that real quick. Right. All right, so move forward here on the slideshow. Oops. So the objectives for today's training is to gain insight into what funders are looking for when they're reviewing grant proposals and determining their funding decisions, to utilize that information to build stronger and more competitive grant proposals, and then hopefully that will increase the amount of grant funds that are available to assist in organization programming. Ultimately here at the foundation, our goal is that we have increased funding coming into the nonprofits of our community, and that makes a positive impact in addressing the community needs. And I want to pause here because I got off base for a minute here, that I didn't start out with my introduction that I wanted to do. I skipped over that to go to the objectives, and I apologize for that. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Susan Buchanan. I'm the Community Impact Manager here at Community Foundation. I've been here in this role for a little over a year. And prior to that, I worked with Washington County government for about 15 years. The majority of that in the grants office, with the last 5 or 6 years of my career being in the role of director of grant management. So in that role, I do have quite a bit of experience in both sides of the coin, applying for grants on behalf of the county, and also administering the various grant programs that we had oversight over. And I believe some of you on this call probably have applied to those grants: Gaming Commission grants, community organization funding grants, and some of the money that came from the COVID relief. There were several specific grants that we did over during that time period as well. So I have the ability to kind of empathize with both sides, being the grant writer and being on the other side of reviewing, being parts of grant review committees. So hopefully what my goal is to be able to take that knowledge and just share that with everyone on the call to help you when you're doing your grant applications. Let me admit, I have someone here to admit, so just take care of that. All right. So I wanted to start the discussion with a general overview of the types of funders. You have your government agencies, federal, state, and local. You have private foundations, philanthropic entities, then corporate funders and corporate foundations as well. And I mean, I would say probably the vast majority or a lot of grants come out of some sort of government entity, either federal, state, or local. And these funders tend to have very, very specific guidelines and restrictions associated with the funding provided. The funding is often authorized through legislation. So there is very strict rules that are associated with that funding because of that. There's not a lot of wiggle room in what going outside of what their authorization is to fund. It's often based upon the role of whatever department it's coming from, whether it be Department of Education, Department of Health. They have very specific things that they are allowed to fund, and they have a lot of associated regulations and restrictions associated with the funding that then is passed on to the grantee of those funds. So what you're going to see when you apply for funding from especially federal and then sometimes state as well, you're going to see a lot of increased reporting requirements, increased special conditions on how you spend the funds. And most of that's due to it's public money, tax money that is being used to fund these programs. So there's a lot more of an effort to ensure transparency and accountability with those funds. On the plus side with those types of fundings, you're usually going to see larger amount of funding that is going to be granted through those types of agencies. You also can see where you may get awards for more than 1 year. You may have multiple year awards, which is really nice as a nonprofit that you can plan for several years to be able to have funding for a program that you're trying to launch. But I would also say those applications tend to be a lot more complicated as well. So when you're looking at federal grants, I don't recommend if you're just starting up as a nonprofit and you're looking at those first as your first experience with writing grants or receiving grants. I wouldn't recommend starting with federal. I would say start at something more local. State can be a little bit better, but often it's tied to federal funding as well, so they have to pass on some of those restrictions. I'm going to pause here just a second so I can let in a couple people. All right. So you have your federal agencies, federal, state, and local. The local funding through government entities tends to be a little more personal, more accessible than the federal and states. So a lot of nonprofits do have success from more localized government grant funding. It still is probably going to be a little bit more of a bigger lift as far as your grant application process than some of your private organizations, but not near as bad as your state or federal. A really good thing about your local government funding is you're going to be able to pick up the phone and call someone and talk to a person. If you have questions, you're going to be able to email someone specifically. When you get into your large federal grants, often what you have is a help desk is your only way of getting any help with your application, that you have to submit a question and wait for an answer. It's very non-personal. And sometimes with the state as well, although they do often have a person that's assigned to you. You just may have to wait a little longer than you would at a more local funding source. And as far as your private foundations, your philanthropic entities, and even your corporate foundations, these organizations generally tend to have a much more streamlined process with their granting as government agencies. not as much reporting necessarily. Their mission or what their funding is based upon what the foundation's mission is, or what the donor intent is with their fund and what they want to provide funding for. Awards are often decided upon by a committee or an individual donor, and this can vary greatly because you can have very small foundations up to very huge foundations. You're going to more likely see smaller, more short-term awards and funding amounts, but you're going to have a more accessible interaction and more ability to have discussion about your application typically. In general, as a rule of thumb, I would say the more local the funding source is, the higher the chance for success for any grant application. So keep this in mind when you're looking for funding opportunities and consider applying for funds, because you want to make sure you put your resources towards something that you have a good chance of having success with. All right. Aligning with funders' goals. When you're doing your research, looking for potential sources of grant funding or funders that you are looking to learn more about, the most important thing that you should be doing is looking for an organization or a grant program that aligns with your organization's goals. You want to make sure you understand the funder's mission and objective for their agency and for whatever the specific grant program is. You want to then assess, well, how well does your proposal or your project that you're seeking funding for fit into these goals? You also want to take those funder goals in mind when you're writing your application proposal, making sure you highlight how your proposal aligns well within that funder's mission and goals. You want to make sure you keep bringing up, if you have a project that you think that really is just a perfect proposal based upon what the funder is looking for and the things that maybe they have put in their guidelines that they are hoping to receive, or they're going to prioritize. Keep putting that in your narrative, how your program is going to impact that mission or that objective that they're looking for. So we're going to start with our pre-application preparation as far as when you're looking at requesting grant funding. So the first part of that process is going to be you're researching the potential grant opportunities. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be thoroughly reading those guidelines and requirements to make sure that the grant will actually work for your organization. You first want to make sure, I would say the number one thing whenever I would see a new grant opportunity pass my desk, I would always go through the guidelines first and foremost to see, is your organization an eligible applicant? Because if it's only an application that a educational institution can apply for and you're not one of those, you're not going to go any further. You're not going to put any more time into that. You know that it's a certain type of 501c3 designation that you need to have, and you have a 501c3 8 and not a 3, then you know that you're not an eligible applicant. So you want to go to that first so that you don't go too far into the process and then realize that you're not an eligible applicant. And those types of things, that the eligible applicant type is rarely there's any wiggle room available for that from a funder. So if you don't pass that first threshold, it's likely that your organization would not be able to receive funding through that opportunity. So you don't want to put too many resources into seeking that type of funding. Second, you want to assess how well does your project fit the funder's requirements? Does the timeline work for receiving the funding? Does is it something that's going to line up with when they actually award the money? You may have a project that you need to have the funding for within the next several months. But when you read the application, you realize that you're not going to get the award for maybe up to a year later. And that does happen a lot of, especially in some governmental grants. So you want to make sure that everything about the timing of even when the applications due fits into what your project's timeline is and what your organization can do. And of course, you also want to go ahead, even because you haven't even applied yet, you want to go ahead and review the reporting and tracking requirements associated with the grant to make sure it's something that you have the capacity to be able to do. You want to make sure that's not something that's going to, you're going to have to incur more costs to be able to meet the requirements of the grant. You should be very strategic about what grants you apply for. Don't waste time on a losing effort or get a grant that's a bad fit for your organization, because you really, just because you couldn't keep up with the reporting or the timeline. Excuse me. All this talking, I'm gonna have to take a quick sip of coffee. Look here, see if there's any questions yet. Okay. Move on here. All right. So as you research your potential grant opportunities, you're going to want to assess how well your project fits the funder's requirements. And make sure that you, as I said, don't put too many resources into something that's not going to be a successful venture. You want to take this pre-application process also as a time to build relationship with your funders. You want to form a positive relationship with your funder to assure continued success. By forming a really good relationship with a funder, you open yourself up for opportunities for even more funding. I have actually been part of some grant funding opportunities where our organization had received grants through a funder, and they had extra money towards the end of that fiscal year that they needed to get off their books. So they came to us because we had a really good relationship, and they're like, here, I'm going to give you this extra money. So cultivating that type of relationship is really super important and can pay off. One suggestion I would say, if you're new to an organization, look at the various grant funds that you may have historically, the organization has historically applied for and received funding for. And then reach out to those funders to introduce yourself, have a phone call, maybe go in and talk to them and learn more about the funds that they've given. That's a really good start. If a funder holds or hosts a grant workshop for that specific application, a lot of times they'll have information sessions. Make sure, if all possible, that you or someone in your organization attends those. That's just a really good opportunity to put a face with your organization and have them get to know you. Another way of forming a relationship with a funder is asking questions related to calling them up, asking questions relating to the funding application or to their program. Organizations are typically, or funders are happy to help with these types of things. Good questions lead to good grant proposals, and it's a common goal between the funder and the applicant. And I will say here, and I say this with all the good intentions in the world, there everyone says there's no such thing as a dumb question, and in most cases that's true. But I would caution that what you want to do is, if there are questions that are clearly addressed in the guidelines, that are really laid out very clearly in the grant guidelines, don't call and ask those questions. Because what you want to do is make a positive impression. So if you call up a funder and who has just put a lot of time and effort into putting out a very clear grant guideline that tells you exactly what an eligible entity is and exactly what the dates are that they need to do and how they need to do things. You don't want to call them up and ask them everything that they have put in those guidelines highlighted and bolded, because it basically is giving the funder that impression that you didn't even read the very first step or take the first step. You didn't go through and read the document. And it does make an impression. Sometimes you make a positive impression, sometimes you make a negative impression. The kind of questions you do want to do and make a positive impact or impression, if you read through those guidelines and there's something that you're not sure about and you call and you want some clarification, those are the types of questions that a funder enjoys getting, because it shows that the person has done their homework and they're really thinking about, they need a little bit more information. Or the kind of questions often that are good questions are, they'll say, here's the kind of project we're looking at. Is this something that is even fundable? Is this the kind of thing that you're looking for? I mean, these are things that are questions that are showing that people are doing their homework and their preparation for a grant. And then you want to do the next part of your pre-application process would be your internal preparation. Are you ready for this grant or this grant application process? You want to make sure that you read ahead through the entire application guidelines and the grant application itself to make sure that you're going to prevent any unpleasant last minute surprises or hiccups or panic moments. You want to, I always suggest, after you've done that, carefully read it and then create a timeline and assign responsibilities within your organization for the application content. Now, if you're a one-man show, then it's all you, but it's still good to have that timeline to have all the things laid out and when you need to have those things. You really need to take in consideration sometimes whether you may have internal approval processes. Some organizations, you actually have to have board approval to even submit a grant application. So you want to make sure you have time to do that process before the due dates. You may need items from outside agencies or other departments within your organization. So you want to make sure you identify that at the very beginning so that you have the ability to give them the time to get the information to you. Often, your request, you need to have a letter of support from another organization to include in your application. And I will say, for one thing that I would definitely suggest, if you need a letter of support from an outside organization, you should always do is provide that organization with a letter template. And basically that shows who it is, a letter that's already pretty much written to whoever it is that you need to write that to, whatever agency or contact for that grant, and just with the general information about the grant you're applying for, so that they would have the ability to just take that template, plop it in on their letterhead with little effort on their part, because often you're asking for someone in another organization who's very super busy, has a million things on their list. And for them to have to come up with a letter on their own, it's going to take a lot more time, and you might not have as much success getting it back in a timely fashion. So it's a really good practice to kind of have that skeleton of a letter in place to offer to that organization when you're asked for that letter of support. I think you'll get it returned at a better frequency and much quicker turnaround on it when you do that. You want to give yourself as much time to have some people coming in here late. Want to stop and let them in here. Okay. You want to gather all the necessary documents and information that you need for your application. You may need to provide a copy of your IRS determination letter. So you want to make sure you identify that in your timeline, that you have that, you find that, you secure that, and have that. You may need other information. You may need a copy of your audit, so you make sure that you can get that information. All that stuff put on your timeline so that you can avoid any last minute, oh, I didn't know I needed that kind of thing, and then have to rush around getting that. What I always recommend and tried to do is to create an internal deadline that was prior to the actual application due date, and use that, pretend that was the actual deadline, and use that to get throughout the whole process. And then when you get it in past on that deadline, you avoid that last minute where if something would happen that would be outside your control, you still have that cushion there. I mean, you never know. There can be last minute emergencies, an illness, IT issues with since a lot of these grants are only accessible through an online application process, and all of a sudden you have that IT issues or internet issues, you can't get it in, weather or something that impacts things. So having that due date not actually be the due date is a really good practice and avoids a lot of last minute stress. So I just want to take a moment and pause to give an opportunity for anybody to have any questions. If you want to, you can put the questions in the chat. Let me see. Or you can raise your hand. Don't see any questions yet, so I'm going to move on. We can always come back if somebody is typing into the chat and I don't get to it now, we'll get to it later. Okay. All right. Now we're into the good part, the writing your grant application. Everybody loves it, I'm sure. So, majority of all grant applications will contain a section where you must state the need that your organization is filling. Because obviously, there's not going to be funding associated with something that there's not a need for. During this section, I recommend, and with all sections of your grant application, I would definitely recommend that you be concise and clear and brief as possible while still communicating the need that you're addressing. You want to make a compelling case using the most recent and localized data available. You want to don't have too much data, so you're just throwing lots of numbers. So make sure you balance that narrative with the data. And then I also would recommend, whenever possible, any data that you use to support the statement of need, use as local as possible, use as current as possible. And I know that's sometimes hard to find. But one thing you should do is you should be continuously gathering data, even when you're not writing grant applications, always looking for the type of data that supports the type of programming that you do so that you can just pull that up when you need it. Next is developing a strong project plan. Most applications have a section where you describe your project or program that you're seeking the funding for. Make sure you're clearly defining the project and provide as much detail as possible. It's amazing that too many organizations will spend so much time talking about, in general, what the organization does and all the needs that they address in the community, but then they never take the time in their application to really define the project that the specific project that they're seeking the funding for. And this is really confusing to the reviewers when they're reading it, because they'll read it and they'll be like, okay, I get an idea of what this organization does, but what are they going to do with the money? And when they're unsure, when there's any kind of uncertainty like that, it tends to lead to denials, because they just really aren't sure what they're being asked. So make sure that you really clearly define your project and provide as much details about it as possible. Describe the specific activities, include timelines. Like if you're going to be providing meals to low-income people, you're going to say how often you're going to provide those meals, what times of the day, days of the week, how often through the year. You're going to talk about how many people that you plan to be able to serve, things of that nature. And another really good idea is to describe the data that you are going to be collecting to evaluate the success of the program. That shows, that the funder that you're already planning, you're looking at these things and collecting the data to demonstrate that you're meeting the need. You want to do everything that you possibly can do to make the project, excuse me, that you're seeking funding for as real and concrete in the reviewer's mind as possible. Next, we go to the budget, everybody's favorite. I feel like this portion of a grant application probably creates the most headaches for applicants and reviewers alike. When a budget is not clearly provided, it often leaves the reviewer with so many unanswered questions, which leads to doubt, which then leads to denials or reduced amounts of funding. When you're providing your budget, now some grants will give you a specific form to use, which will help, so you at least can follow, what they're looking for, but not always, they don't always do that. So I would just recommend that you make sure that you provide detailed descriptions of all the expenditure categories, line items such as salaries, office supplies, mileage, etc. And then break down how that's, what that's being used for the project. Don't just attach a copy of your organization's annual budget or a financial statement. I mean, you may be requested to provide those, but when they're asking for the actual program budget, you need to just provide what's actually the budget for the program that you're requesting the funding for. This is also a good place that you can let funders know of any matching funds that you're providing or other entities, or any in-kind contributions. This shows that you have buy-in from your own budget and also from other funders. If you have things like equipment or services that you're going to be contracting out for, make sure that you include cost estimates, proposals, and along with your budget to show that you've actually shopped around to find a price for that. One helpful hint I would give everybody when compiling your budget is reviewers like when you have an odd number funding request amount. And by an odd number, I mean, instead of $10,000, you're requesting $10,245.35. Because when you have a request amount that's like that, and then the budget that you provide adds up to that amount, it shows that you've done all the research and the homework and have compiled a budget based upon what the actual numbers are and what your actual needs are, and it's not just a guess. Writing style and presentation. So this is, I mean, when you're writing your grant application, this is some of the most important components that you want to make sure that they're well written. So write with clarity and conciseness, use bullet points, charts, even if appropriate. Don't fall into the trap that you feel like you have to fill up the pages if there's like pages given or space available. Reviewers are not looking for long applications. They're often reviewing many applications. So a long and wordy application may be passed over for a short and cut and slice one. So as I said, make it something that's easy to read. Avoid jargon and acronyms. This is something that is very common to see. Don't assume that reviewers speak the language of your particular field. And we all probably are guilty of that. We talk about our work and we think everybody understands what we use on an everyday basis within our field, but it's not necessarily something that goes across all fields. And your reviewers can be from all walks of life. So make sure that you are taking those types of field specific terms and avoiding them. And if you use an acronym, because sometimes acronyms are necessary because they're abbreviation for a really long word that you have to use more than once, and you don't want to have to keep doing that. So if you use an acronym, make sure the first time you use it that you actually define what it is so that the reader then knows what you're talking about. Proofread. Now, obviously, you want to proofread for errors and punctuation, spelling, things of that nature, because you definitely want not to have a proposal that's full of all kinds of errors, because it just doesn't have that good impression that you want. But you also, I would suggest that you would have someone proofread your application that's not in your organization or even in your industry. Have them read it and see if they understand what you're saying and what you're asking for. And then once again, another thing is make sure you follow all the directions and the grant guidelines and the submission packet for how you put together the application. No matter how silly they may seem to you, and sometimes they do, because they're there for a reason. And avoid copy and paste, or if you do use copy and paste, use it carefully. And I definitely understand you may be putting in multiple applications for the same project to different funders, and you don't want to waste your time when you can easily copy and paste. But if you're going to do that copy and pasting, and those, where it's appropriate to do, make sure make sure that you're incorporating it in, that you make sure the font's all matching, that it's not obvious, oh, they just copy this in. Or if it's like you put an application every year into the same funder for the same program, don't just copy and paste the entire application and then don't even remember to change the dates and things of it, because the funders often are there more than 1 year and they can tell. Common pitfalls and how to avoid them. I guess I would say one of the major pitfalls or reasons behind an unsuccessful application is the misalignment with the funder's priorities. And we talked about this at the very beginning, and I talk about this a lot in this training, and it's because this is one of the biggest things areas where I think nonprofits can go wrong, where they're putting in grant applications for funding opportunities that really they aren't going to be able to compete in because they're misaligned. They're not aligned with the funder's priorities. So if you're unsure if your project fits, reach out to the funder and make sure, ask the questions to see. And if they are giving you feedback that they don't really see that it's something that's going to be fundable through their grant, it's okay not to apply for that. It's okay not to apply for every grant. And I know some of you, may be development directors, and you feel that you need to apply for as many grants as possible, that you maybe your board expects you to, and I understand that. But grant writing is very time consuming. So you don't want to be wasting time on applications that you're highly unlikely to receive funding for, because you're basically losing that time that you could be using more wisely. You could be using it for fundraising efforts. You could be using it to look for other grants or applying for other grants that you will have a good fit with. So when you're looking at applying, make sure that when the applications you submit, you feel like you have a reasonably good shot of applying, of having success with, especially ones that take a lot of time. There may be some that you might, applications that are super simple that you could just in an afternoon answer some questions and submit an electronic submission. And I mean, that's something that you're like, well, it ain't going to hurt to try. But if you're going to have an application that's going to take a lot of time and effort from your organization, you want to make sure it's something that you have a reasonably good chance of being successful with. Incomplete or inaccurate applications. Avoid submitting these at all costs, because you really would be extremely unlikely to receive funding for these. And it also, because it makes a really bad impression, which could last longer than just that one grant cycle. Your application is the impression that your organization gives to the reviewers. If it's full of errors and it's incomplete, why would they trust your organization to spend their funds wisely? So just always keep that in mind. If you don't understand something about how you're supposed to package your application or what you're supposed to do, ask for clarification. If there's required items that you're not really sure what they are, ask for some help with that. And I always recommend that you communicate these questions as early as possible with the funder. Don't wait till the last day, last hours, last minutes, because they're not necessarily always going to be available within that time frame, or they may be having a big, a run of questions from a lot of people at that same time, and they will have a hard time being able to answer all those questions within the timeline. Lack of demonstrated impact. You must provide evidence that your program will impact the issue. The whole reason why these grant funds are being offered by organizations is because there's some impact that they want to make on some specific issue or need. So if you don't take the opportunity with your grant application to show how your program is going to make that impact, it's unlikely to receive funding. So make sure you provide evidence to make your case. For example, if you know that other organizations have had success with a program that you're trying to initiate in your area, use the data of how successful that program has been in other areas, so that they can see that this is something that will make an impact. Discuss how you will track the project and gauge its progress. Show the funders that you are planning for the future, that you have a sustainability or continuation plan for the project and program. And finally, we get to post-submission activities. So you've gotten your grant application in, and it's a big sigh of relief there in itself. So in the case, let's say that your hard work has paid off and you received a grant award. Don't stop communicating with your funder at this point. This is a great opportunity to stand out and to maintain that positive relationship that you're trying to build. Take your mom's advice and always send a thank you note. It seems to be it's a small thing, but it is appreciated, and it makes you kind of stand out from maybe the other recipients that didn't do that. Make sure that you submit all your reports that are required promptly. I highly recommend, and this is very important, communicate any changes and delays in your project to the funder as soon as possible. Sometimes you have to write a grant application 6 months or to a year before you actually receive the funding. So by the time you get a funding award, there could be things that have changed. Reach out to that funder immediately and let them know what is going on, because they're going to want to make this work. They've already awarded you money, so they're going to want to try to make this work. So it's a good thing to reach out and have that open communication. Definitely don't use your funds on another purpose without written approval. So if you're going to change the scope of your project and it's a different things are going to be funded, make sure you get that written permission right away. Another thing that people don't think about as far as making good impressions with their funder, spend your money. Especially with state and federal awards, they look at this. Part of your reporting is how much money you spent in that quarter. If you are asking for money and you say you need this money for this program, and then you get the award and you're not spending it, it's frustrating to funders, because they're like, well, I don't know that they needed that money. But if you show that you're spending your money, they know that you're doing the work that they funded you for, and they also often could look at giving you additional money if you've been spending your money at a really good rate, and they have extra money that they have to get off the books before the end of the year. Another thing would always be credit your funder in all publicity about whatever your program is. Everyone likes to feel appreciated, and that goes to funders as well. And once again, I just reiterate, maintaining a positive relationship with your funder really makes it more likely for you to have continued and additional funding. Learning from rejections. We can't win them all. No matter what, you're not always going to get your grant application approved or funded. And while it really stinks to be rejected, you still can use this as an opportunity to learn and improve your future applications. You can ask for feedback from the funders, or they're usually more than happy to give feedback. And then you can make those, use that feedback to make adjustments for your next year's application. Or you can learn that maybe that's not a good program for you because it really isn't lined up with what you're doing. One thing I will always caution people, when you get that denial letter, you may be feeling very emotional about it at the time, especially if it was a grant that you really thought you were going to get. Resist an overly emotional response. You don't want to burn any bridges with your funders. So don't pick up that phone and make a really heated phone call, or write an email that you can't, recall back, because you really need to look at it as oftentimes the reason why you're not funded is just because there simply wasn't enough money to give to every organization. There's limited funds, and it's not personal. And you don't want to burn a bridge, because nobody likes to be yelled at or berated over the phone. So, and that's something that will, the funders will remember. So it's fine to call, and it's fine to, say you're disappointed and ask for your feedback, but don't just call with an angry outburst of why, of why your project should have been funded over others. Oftentimes, and I will say probably about 99% of the time, the person who's going to take your call wasn't even part of the process of making the decision. They were there, but they didn't have a vote. So you just don't want to do that. You want to maintain a positive and professional relationship. So I'm going to take this point to answer any questions you may have. I do see that I think we've had some maybe come in through the chat. Okay, let's go. I'll read the questions. Please explain again about what I meant about the 10,000 versus 10,350 and 45 cents. Basically what I mean about that is when you're, and this is not a hard fast rule, because most people, when they ask for a grants, it seems like they just do an even number. And I think it's because they feel like they just round off a lot of their numbers when they're doing their budget. But what I really mean by that is the amount of money that you're asking for should be based upon what your actual budget is for the program you're seeking funding for, and what the dollar amount that you need. And the more it's based on facts, such as what the actual estimate is for whatever you're trying to do, if it's buying a piece of equipment or something, or the amount of time someone's salary, or things, it should be done. You should do that budget homework to really identify what the amount of money is you need. So when a reviewer sees a number like $10,350 as opposed to 10,000 even, they know that the budget that they used to come up with that, they were using actual numbers, not just estimates. I hope that answers your question. It doesn't mean that if you do an even number that you're not going to get funded. It just, I always recall people will make note, oh, we see that number they gave us. We know they really, did their homework. It's based upon actual numbers, not just an estimate. The other a question I have is about sending a copy of the slides. Yes, I will be sending out to everybody that registered for this training a copy of these slides. And we do have a recording of this that we will be posting, we hope to post, on our website, in our nonprofit resources section. And if you haven't already visited that, I would recommend that you do. We have some resources there for where you can find grant funding. We have our grant funding calendar that highlights all the grants that we offer through the foundation. And it's on a calendar basis, so you can look in your planning process to see when these applications open. Make sure I didn't miss any other questions. Any other questions from anyone that didn't put it in the chat? If anybody does have any questions that they think of, I always think of questions after the fact. Feel free to email me. You all have my email, and it's also on the slides and on our website. I hope that I was able to give you some information that will be helpful. We do plan on trying to do more trainings for nonprofits in the future on various categories. So be looking for that. We'll be sending out emails about that and posting it on our social media. So hopefully everybody will have learned at least one thing from this today and take that and go on to have some successful grant applications. I thank you very much for joining us. You all have a good day.